Hello, how are you doing today? I hope you're doing well and you're having a good day. So, today I wanted us to look at the topic respiration in biology. So, the objectives for the lesson is we are going to understand what respiration is, and then we'll discover the types of tissue respiration, and then we are going to look at the word equations and how ATP is produced, as well as the importance of this respiration in our bodies. So to start with, respiration is simply the release of energy from food substances in living cells. So when we include living cells in our definition, we need to know to say this definition applies to tissue respiration, which is also called cellular respiration or internal respiration. Now, this same term respiration can also be used to mean the process that helps to make oxygen available to living cells. So now whenever we deal with oxygen being available to living cells, we deal with breathing, which is also known as ventilation, and we also deal with gaseous exchange. And we know over different kinds of organisms, there are different gaseous exchange surfaces. So examples in human beings, the gaseous exchange surface is the alveoli or the air sac. So whenever we deal with gaseous exchange and breathing, we need to know to say we are dealing with external respiration. But when we deal with the release of energy from food substances in living cells, we deal with internal respiration, which is also called tissue respiration or cellular respiration. So let's move on to this quick summary, which is showing us a breakdown. So we are saying respiration can either be external respiration or internal respiration. So this external respiration, we need to know to say energy is used and it occurs outside living cells. And then the examples of this external respiration, we have breathing and we also have gaseous exchange. So we move on to another one, which is internal respiration. We are saying in internal respiration, energy is released inside the living cells. And the two types of internal respiration or cellular respiration is aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. So in aerobic respiration, we need to know to say oxygen is used, carbon dioxide is produced, and then water is also produced. When we deal with anaerobic respiration, oxygen in anaerobic respiration is not used. So there are two types of anaerobic respiration. We have lactic fermentation, where we produce lactic acid, and we also have alcoholic fermentation, where we produce an alcohol, for example, ethanol. So let's get into detail looking at internal respiration. So in internal respiration, we need to know to say this one occurs in living cells in organelles that are called the mitochondria. So this mitochondria is also known as the powerhouse of the cell, and it helps to make energy available in form of ATP. So the main substrate for internal respiration in most organisms is glucose. And there are two types of internal respiration, and these are aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. So here the word that is used is internal respiration. They can also say tissue respiration or cellular respiration. Whenever we hear any of those terms used interchangeably, we need to know to say we have aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So what is aerobic respiration? This is simply the release of energy from food in living cells in the presence of oxygen. So this process is going to release high amounts of energy, and the equivalence of that energy is 2,880 kilojoules of energy from 1 mole of glucose. And the byproducts are carbon dioxide and water. So this type of respiration occurs in tissue cells of animals and plants when there is sufficient supply of oxygen. So the word equation and the chemical equation is as follows. So for the word equation for aerobic respiration, we have glucose plus oxygen to produce carbon dioxide plus water plus energy. So these are the reactants and these are the products that are produced. So the chemical equation is C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus O2, which is oxygen, to produce CO2, that is carbon dioxide, plus H2O, which is water, plus energy, which is 2880 kilojoules. So this is in aerobic respiration. Let's move on to anaerobic respiration. So whenever you hear of anaerobic respiration, this is simply the release of energy from food substances in living cells in the absence of oxygen. In aerobic respiration, it happens in the presence of oxygen. In anaerobic respiration, this type occurs in the absence of oxygen. Since we are dealing with the absence of oxygen, we need to know that there are two types of anaerobic respiration. That is alcoholic fermentation, where we produce an alcohol, for example, ethanol, and we also have lactic fermentation, where we produce lactic acid. So moving on, we are saying in alcoholic fermentation, this is simply the release of energy from food substances in living cells in the absence of oxygen. So this is going to help produce ethanol, which is an alcohol, as well as carbon dioxide as byproducts. Okay, so this process releases a relatively low amount of energy, which is simply 210 kilojoules of energy from 1 mole of glucose. Remember, in aerobic respiration, we said the energy released is 2880 kilojoules of energy from 1 mole of glucose. In anaerobic respiration, we release 210 kilojoules of energy from 1 mole of glucose. So this reaction is catalyzed by an enzyme called zymase. So this zymase is naturally found in yeast. So the word and chemical equation for alcoholic fermentation is given below. So here is our word equation. We have glucose. Remember, we said this one happens in the absence of oxygen. So there is no oxygen. We just have glucose in the presence of zymase, which is an enzyme found in yeast. This is going to help produce carbon dioxide and alcohol as well as energy. So the chemical equation is as follows. We have glucose, zymase to produce carbon dioxide plus C2H5OH. So this C2H5 is ethane. When we put an OH, it becomes an ethanol, which is an alcohol, right? And then we have energy, which is 210 kilojoules. So let's look at this little passage a little bit. So we are being told here to say alcoholic fermentation takes place in yeast. So alcoholic fermentation is important in brewing and in baking. So in both cases, yeast is the organism that is used to carry out the alcoholic fermentation. So when brewing, germinating seeds are used because they contain sugar maltose. So the seeds are dried and ground to form a powder. So this powder is then boiled in water to form a paste. The paste is then cooled and yeast is added. So yeast contains an enzyme called zymase, which converts glucose to carbon dioxide and alcohol, releasing energy in the process. Then the glucose is formed from the action of maltose on maltose. So this maltase is an enzyme which works on maltose. Then the alcohol is removed from the mixture by simple distillation. So when baking, flour is mixed with water, salt, sugar, and yeast to form a paste that we call a dough. When there is insufficient oxygen, zymase from yeast acts on sugars to form carbon dioxide and an alcohol. But if oxygen is sufficient, Yeast carries out aerobic